But Brittany, it's his hubris. It's his arrogance, which means, unfortunately, I really do believe that he deserves a massive financial hit as a result of this.
Judge Nicklin didn't just rule on a case. Judge Nicklin detonated a financial time bomb directly under Prince Harry. And the number that came out of that courtroom wasn't just shocking, it was catastrophic. 97 claims, 97 chances to prove something, anything, and every single one collapsed like a house of cards in a storm nobody could stop.
Gavin Burrows, an old-school private eye investigator who for the past 30 years has made his living accessing the personal information most of us want kept secret. Well, Gavin, you come from a profession that is certainly dark and murky, don't you?
Some people might describe it like that. Some people might describe it as informative. I'm not going to say I was an angel when I first started out, but it was a bit like the Wild West in the 90s.
And here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this wasn't just a legal defeat, this was a complete unraveling, the kind that makes people start asking questions they weren't supposed to ask. What exactly was Prince Harry thinking walking into that courtroom so confident? And more importantly, who convinced Prince Harry this case was ever winnable in the first place? Because the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Prince Harry didn't walk in alone. Elton John, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, Baroness Lawrence, names with power, names with influence, names that don't usually gamble on weak foundations. And yet, here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder, backing a case that was supposed to shake the British press to its core. This wasn't just a lawsuit, it was framed as a reckoning, a final showdown.
It was not an off-the-cuff, angry statement. You know, they knew about the verdict beforehand. And also, frankly, I don't think Harry's smart enough to come up with an off-the-cuff statement. So this statement was prepared at least a day in advance. And what was interesting about it, it was only Baroness Lawrence and Harry on it. Elton John, who knows quite well how the courts work, didn't sign it.
The moment Prince Harry would finally take control of the narrative that had followed him for decades. The Daily Mail wasn't just a newspaper in this story, it was the villain Prince Harry had been preparing to confront for years, especially over coverage involving Meghan. And suddenly, everything felt personal, too personal. The headlines, the accusations, the emotional weight Prince Harry carried into that courtroom, it wasn't just legal strategy. It was something deeper, something raw, something unresolved. And that's exactly where things start to blur. Because when emotion takes the driver's seat, logic doesn't just step aside, it disappears. And that's when mistakes begin. Big ones. Judge Nicklin saw it coming before anyone else admitted it. Quiet warnings, subtle signals, a case that had cracks long before it ever reached a courtroom. But no one stopped. No one paused. No one pulled back. The trial moved forward like a train that had already lost its brakes. And when the judgment finally landed, 400 pages of code. Methodical destruction, it didn't just reject the claims, it dismantled them piece by piece. Not one success, not one small win to hold on to. Just a clean, brutal sweep. And that's when the real story begins. Because losing wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next. Because buried inside that judgment was a quiet but devastating truth. Belief is not evidence. Suspicion is not proof. And everything Prince Harry felt, every frustration, every grievance, every deeply held conviction, none of it met the standard required inside that courtroom. 97 claims dismissed. Completely. And that kind of total defeat doesn't just happen by accident. It points to something deeper. Something fundamentally broken in the foundation of the case itself. And that foundation had a name. Gavin Burrows, a man with a past that already raised eyebrows. 30 years in a profession built on secrets, surveillance, and information that people never wanted exposed. Not exactly the kind of figure you expect to be the cornerstone of a high-stakes royal legal battle. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Gavin Burrows wasn't just involved, Gavin Burrows was central. Paid £75,000 to provide information that would help take down one of the most powerful media organizations in the country. £75,000 for credibility, for testimony, for truth. But truth has a strange way of shifting when pressure builds. Because what Gavin Burrows said years ago and what Gavin Burrows said now didn't match, not even close. Details that were once described with confidence suddenly became vague. Actions that sounded personal suddenly turned into general observations. First-hand knowledge transformed into expert opinion. And just like that, the man at the center of the case started slipping through everyone's fingers. And then something happened that no one could have predicted, or maybe if they were paying attention. They should have. Gavin Burrows didn't just change his story. Gavin Burrows picked up the phone and called the other side, the Daily Mail's legal team, the same side Prince Harry was trying to defeat. Let that sink in. The key figure, the paid insider, the supposed pillar of the entire case, switched sides, not quietly, not subtly, completely, and suddenly the narrative flipped. The same man who was supposed to support the claims was now calling the entire lawsuit a scam. Not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, a scam. And when someone at the center of your case uses a word like that, everything starts to collapse faster than anyone can contain it. Because now it's not just about weak evidence, it's about whether the case should have ever existed at all. And here's where it gets even darker, because buried in the details was something that should have stopped everything in its tracks. Gavin Burrows later admitted he had been using cocaine during the exact period he was advising on the case. Read that again. The central figure, the paid contributor, the man whose information helped shape a multi-million-pound legal battle, was not operating in a stable state. And somehow this didn't stop the case. This didn't trigger alarms. This didn't force a rethink. Instead, everything continued forward as if nothing had changed. And that raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore. Who exactly was verifying anything at this point? Because when your key witness collapses, your evidence shifts and your foundation starts cracking. Continuing forward isn't confidence, it's something else, something far more dangerous. And this is where everything turned from a legal defeat into something far more uncomfortable, far more revealing, because the courtroom didn't just expose a weak case, it exposed contradictions that couldn't be explained away. Charlotte Griffiths walked into that same courtroom carrying a version of events that didn't just challenge Prince Harry. It directly collided with what Prince Harry had already said under oath. A friendship described one way by Prince Harry suddenly appeared completely different when Charlotte Griffiths spoke. Conversations, familiarity, even a nickname Mr. Mischief details that don't belong to distant acquaintances but to something far closer, something real. And then came the quiet but devastating reversal. It wasn't Prince Harry who ended that connection, it was Charlotte Griffiths. Two versions, one courtroom, one truth. And the silence that followed that contradiction, it didn't help Prince Harry. It made everything heavier, harder to defend, impossible to ignore. Because once one crack appears, people start looking for more. And they didn't have to look far. The moment with Spare didn't just raise eyebrows, it froze the entire room. Prince Harry stating something clearly, firmly under oath, only for his own published words to rise up and contradict him in real time. Not someone else's account, not a misquote, his own book, his own version of events. And suddenly the narrative Prince Harry had spent years trying to control turned into evidence against him. That's not a minor slip. That's the kind of moment that changes how everything else is viewed. Because if one statement doesn't hold, what else doesn't? And yet, even after all of this, even after the contradictions, the collapsing testimony, the shifting foundation, the verdict still hadn't delivered its final blow. Because what Prince Harry did next didn't just raise questions, it shocked people who had been watching quietly until that point. Within minutes of that 400-page judgment landing, before anyone could realistically read it, analyze it, or even begin to understand its full weight, Prince Harry released a statement, not a cautious response, not a measured reflection, a direct accusation, a whitewash, declared instantly, decisively, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the judgment was written. And that's when something subtle but critical happened. Names didn't appear. Elton John wasn't there. Elizabeth Hurley wasn't there. Sadie Frost wasn't there. Those same figures who stood alongside Prince Harry at the start of this battle were suddenly absent at the exact moment that statement demanded unity. Only Baroness Lawrence remained beside Prince Harry. And absence in moments like this speaks louder than any signature ever could, because when people choose not to align themselves publicly, it's rarely accidental. Then the consequences began to take shape, and they weren't theoretical, they were numbers. Associated newspapers pursuing tens of millions in legal costs, insurance covering only a fraction, leaving a gap so large it stopped being a bill and started becoming a crisis. Joint and several liability hanging over everything, meaning the burden didn't stay neatly divided, it could shift, expand, land disproportionately. And suddenly the scale of what Prince Harry was facing wasn't just significant, it was overwhelming, because the safety nets people assume exist weren't guaranteed. Insurance, questioned, coverage, uncertain, and when those layers begin to peel away, what's left is exposure. Raw financial exposure on a scale few people ever experience. And when that reality settles in, people look for solutions. They look for support. They look for allies. But here's where the story tightens even further. Elton John had already stepped back. Quietly, firmly, King Charles existed in a position that wasn't just complicated, it was impossible, balancing roles that couldn't be reconciled without without consequences. William sent a message without saying a word, a public signal that didn't require explanation because it was already understood. And suddenly the network that once surrounded Prince Harry didn't look as solid as it once did. And just when it seemed like the story couldn't tighten any further, another layer appeared. Dr. Sophie Shandoka, not a background figure, not a passive participant. Someone with her own standing, her own credibility, and now her own legal action. But this time, the roles were reversed. Prince Harry wasn't leading. Prince Harry wasn't directing. Prince Harry was defending. And that changes everything because control shifts, timing shifts, pressure shifts.